Hello! Welcome back, Extempers, speech and debaters, and everybody else listening to this podcast. I know we've kept you waiting for a week now to continue with the rest of this podcast because we didn't do any questions last week. But guess what? All of your questions about Russia and Ukraine and the possibility of World War III happening, we're going to answer those today. And get this. Instead of just 2 Extemp questions, we now have time to talk about 5 whole Extemp questions with y'all. 5 Extemp questions. So I hope all of you are excited, ready to hear the end of this topic and podcast, and also ready to not get drafted. But anyway, on a side note, thank you all for listening and supporting us throughout this crazy journey. We are on our 23rd episode. We are 2 episodes away from the 25th episode, and that's just like really exciting because it's almost like a milestone, a landmark. I don't know about you, Spencer, but I think it's pretty exciting.
It is very exciting, and we've got something very good for 25. We've got it planned. We're really excited. That is going to be a very good episode. I've actually been planning this episode for couple of weeks now. We've got a very talented extemper, one of the best that has ever stepped foot in the state of Wyoming. I will just say it now, it is not Lauren Blackwelder, but it is somebody who is really good, who really kind of created Wyoming to become a very successful extemp state. There is just a lot. We've got a really good topic. We're going to hit some really cool theory that you've never heard before, and we're going to spice it up. The questions that I've selected are really good too. So I've been waiting for this one. This one's going to be good. Hyping it up now. One quick thing. I think this is important. Josh, don't edit this out. Okay? Josh is our editor, in case if you guys don't know. This is actually kind of a public service announcement about what's going to happen here. And I think this is actually relatively important for the people who listen. This is the last episode for the next 4 weeks that I am going to be in. Okay. I am taking off to the Wyoming legislative session. I have been granted permission by YuYu to kind of take this time off. I really need it. It's going to be very busy. And doing this plus schoolwork is just going to be insane by itself. So YuYu will be joined with a special guest for 3 of the 4 episodes. We're not going to say who it is. No spoilers. Okay. Maybe follow our social media. Maybe we'll post about it there. But one of those episodes in that break is going to be, I will be in that episode, and that's going to be the special guest episode that we are going to actually be recording tomorrow for us. So not tomorrow when this is published, but tomorrow in terms of our time. So we've had this planned for a while. In 4 weeks, we're going to actually have a double upload, and we're going to go through. So you'll have the final episode with the original special guest, and then we're going to have an episode on the Wyoming legislative session. And the reason why we're going to do that is, first off, I'm going to have ton of experience being in the legislature, and I'm going to be able to explain kind of what happened with Wyoming. I know it's like a very Wyoming specific, Wyoming centric topic. We know that some people don't just listen to this for Wyoming. They listen to this for other states or the entire US or international issues, etc. So that's kind of an important thing to note. And one of the things that we want to really hit on in that is kind of how government works, which is pretty important for you guys, because the tough thing is while we might know how government works, a lot of people really don't. And I want to kind of explain it and be able to break it down for you guys. So firsthand experience, that's going to be a primary source. You don't get a lot of those with these podcasts, so we're excited.
Wow. As for saying no spoilers, you spoiled the whole episode. So whether this makes it into the actual podcast or not, no one will know until this podcast or when we do the double episode. Also, no shade to Lauren Blackwelder. We love her. She might or might not be a guest on this episode. Who knows? Tune in. Keep up with their social media. Keep a lookout for notifications. But anyway, back onto the topic of Russia and Ukraine. As of right now, no big conflict has happened yet. So that is like the special update that you get from us after a week. Nothing. But by the time this is posted, maybe something has happened. What has happened, though, is that Russia has started to increase the amount of troops that they have near the border of Ukraine, which is worrying a lot of nations, especially NATO nations and like European nations, and even Ukraine a little bit. I know now Zelensky, president of Ukraine, if you didn't know, is starting to become a little bit more nervous about the Russian presence on that border. But other than that, there's not really that much of an update unless Spencer has something to add to that.
I think that's a pretty easy summary. Not too much. I'm aware of Russian training that's beginning to start a little bit with their military there. So it's almost like they're preparing for combat. I'm seeing sources that are saying that if Russia is to invade, the capital of Ukraine would fall in 72 hours. There's a lot of like war predictions that are in the news. Just understand, like, I don't really think that a fall of the capital in 72 hours, like, I don't really think that that is something that you can completely rely on with a source. Like, if it's really by a war analyst, then maybe we can look at it that way. But there's just a lot of news. Be careful in what you read, and just double check and make sure that everything is right.
Yeah. I agree with that. And I guess just like another thing right now, along with the increasing amount of Russian troops on the border, President Biden has stated that US citizens residing within Ukraine should maybe start thinking about moving out of Ukraine, just in case anything has happened. But other than that, what Spencer said, just be careful where you get your news about war predictions and about just news in general. So be aware of that. But other than that, like, just to give you like a quick update on or not update, but just like a quick summary of what we talked about in the last episode. Right now, Russia wants concessions from the United States to ensure that Ukraine never joins NATO, or it just like doesn't join NATO during Putin's presidency. And the US hasn't necessarily made an agreement, and they're still at a standstill. So there's not really that much concessions that are going on, but we can talk about that a little bit later on when we get to that question. So the first question that we do want to start on is, does the UN need to be playing a part in the growing crisis in Ukraine? We can let Spencer start us off.
Great. Where do we begin with this question? The UN has what's called a peacekeeping group, and that's really where I think this question is going, is to ensure that there's going to be peace between both Ukraine and Russia. And for the most part, having a peacekeeping group is not a bad idea, right? It's there as a third party. It acts to ensure that no conflict occurs between two sides. And for the most part, that's not bad. These are people that don't partake in war. They're not meant to fight for one side or another. They're meant to ensure that if war is to happen, that it sounds weird to say war being peaceful, but that's the first thing that came to my mind. Or to ensure that conflict doesn't like happen. And that's the ultimate goal of what the UN would do in this scenario. Honestly, though, I think that only makes the problem worse. I think that that's going to provide some trouble in showing that, like, I think that is a very westernized issue, because what Russia's obviously doing is it's clear that they're looking to either attack the West or show like some power to the West, right? And the UN, whether we like to admit it or not, is a westernized idea. And I think that's going to provide some really big trouble for Ukraine in this kind of particular scenario. I think we would see an increased presence for Russia invading into Ukraine. I think it would be very difficult for Ukraine to hold a stance against Russia in that instance. Actually, I don't know if that's a true statement. So don't quote me on that. That might need to be edited out. But I think that Russia in particular would be given heightened war senses with that. Even though Russia does have a representative in the UN, that does not mean that having peacekeeping organizations or peacekeeping troops is a good idea to prevent Russia from coming in. So I think that the UN playing a role in Ukraine is not the best idea. But I think that if it was really to be established for peacekeeping and it holds to peacekeeping and both sides agree that it's there for peacekeeping, then it could be good. But I just don't see that happening with Russia having this really anti-West idealism right now.
Yeah, and I think like another thing just to mention is that it's not whether like, oh, they should or shouldn't, right? It's also like what they can do. Like, what can the UN really do in this situation besides maybe providing peaceful troops? And to me, it doesn't seem like the UN can do much just because of how stalled peace talks are, or like concessions and discussions are between Russia and Western countries, but mainly with like the United States, right? So we're seeing a standstill. Nothing's happening. No de-escalation process seems to be in the works right now, as Russia is sending like more troops to the border. The United States is getting more anxious. Western countries are getting more anxious. So it really doesn't seem like the UN has the ability to do much, especially when these talks are happening inside the UN, right? And another thing to consider is that like Moscow, Russia is a part of the United Nations, and they also have veto power within the United Nations. So whatever agreement that UN could come up with, like most Western countries could come up with, it might not even matter at all because Russia would just be able to like veto it if they don't agree with it. And so other than fostering discussions, I don't really know what else the UN can do. That being said, I do think that the United Nations needs to be playing a part in this crisis just because as an entity or as an organization, the United Nations deals with many conflicts between countries. And if you can talk within a diplomatic setting like the UN, then you could potentially come to a agreement that doesn't require war to push the other person into agreements. So I don't know how much the UN can do, but I do think as like a stance or as just like imagery, I guess, they can have the ability to foster talks between these two parties and come up with some other options like diplomatic negotiation and diplomatic talks rather than just like immediately going into war.
I think there's a good connection to go back to last week's episode. I brought up in the background about the Minsk Accords, which are accords that are between Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia to try to ease the tensions between both of them. And we know that that has failed. And Germany and France are pretty good at helping with negotiations. So that usually says something. I think that there is not a very good probability of the UN being able to make peace out of this if Russia has its own intentions right now. And it looks to be very clear that Russia's got its own intentions. So what's the point? And I think that the UN I think it's ultimately going to make this problem worse. I don't think it will make it better. As much as I would love the UN to make it better, it just won't.
I don't necessarily like agree with that, I guess. It's not that like they will make things better. I think that like it doesn't do much and it doesn't hurt. It's just like there. To me, it seems like the United Nations is like an organization like NATO. So for those of you who are doing the PF topic, you know that there's tensions between Greece and Turkey. But what NATO can provide is like mediating ground between these two countries to talk diplomatically about their problems without getting into conventional warfare or like conflict. I feel like that's what the UN does in this scenario for Russia, Ukraine, and Western countries, just because, yeah, like it doesn't really do much except exist. But under the UN and being a part of the UN means that like you're trying to work together with each other on things. That's why it's called the United Nations, right? So will it actually do some action to make things better? Probably not. But will it make things worse? Not clear. I think at the moment it's doing what it's supposed to do, which is like starting mediation, or like not starting mediation, but like just having mediation going on between these two countries without the risk of conflict, I guess, because there's always a risk of conflict, but like without conflict being the first option on each other's table.
Yeah, I don't think I've got much to add on this question. I think this one's a pretty straightforward one. We've got some more difficult ones here, so I think we should move on, go through more difficult questions. The next question is, how should NATO respond if Russia makes a minor incursion into Ukraine? This is actually the first of two hypotheticals. This is an if question in the middle there, so this is actually like, what if this is to happen? So how should NATO respond if Russia makes a minor incursion into Ukraine? And you let me start last time, I'll let you start this time. I think the first thing that's important though, YuYu, is define minor incursion or
Right.
minor incursion.
Right. Yeah, I think like that's something that we've talked about in my international security class this quarter, is just like define invasion. Like, what does that mean? Right? Was it annexing Crimea invasion? Is just being at the border also a definition to like put into invasion, right? And along with defining what like minor incursion means, does that also mean invasion, right? And the importance behind that is just it makes it a little bit more different, because also in politics, words and definitions of words play a huge role in how policymakers or like actors act and make decisions. So if it is a minor incursion and you separate that from invasion, then what will most likely happen is NATO will probably respond. NATO countries will send troops into Ukraine, as they are still doing. The deployment of, I think it was 1,000 that I said in the last episode that Biden had sent to Ukraine, will probably like act on that and try to prevent, further incursion, because a minor incursion might happen, but you don't know if it's a minor incursion until the end of it, just because even though it seems like a minor incursion, it could be bigger, right? And in terms of like providing a definition to what minor incursion means, it's kind of like difficult, because you really have to understand what other countries think of minor incursion, and those definitions are always subject to change. But to me, it seems like minor incursion just sounds like Russia steps foot on Ukrainian borders, or not Ukrainian borders, on Ukrainian land. And if that happens, the question of how should NATO respond if that happens you'll probably only have like one option for that, and that's just like send troops there, defensive troops there. I think a good thing to also mention within your speech is, if you don't want an escalation into conflict, they should not escalate the conflict by like, sending in full force, doing more offensive attacks and stuff like that. Like, the things that they should be doing is being more defensive rather than offensive, just to prevent escalation from happening, more lives to be lost. That's really unnecessary, stuff like that. And I think what they've already been doing in terms of like sending weapons there, like Turkey sending drones to Ukraine, and also the United States sending troops there and having some other troops on standby in other countries nearby, is already enough preparation to show some sort of sign, or to signal some sort of sign to Russia that if Russia were to make an incursion, that they would get like there would be a response against that, and they would be defended against or hurt. And so, yeah, I would say like my response is just simply have troops there to defend.
I don't know if I agree with your definition. Just doing a quick Google search, the definition of incursion means a raid. And that is the way that Merriam-Webster defines it. So yes, we're playing the definition game today. But this is a hypothetical. And I think that's part of the reason why we've got to play that game. So a minor raid is where it's really going, which is if we look at it a little bit deeper, it's like an eve. And what that is like it's like it's a raid before a raid happens. So what we're looking at is it is an offensive attack, is what it would be. So it would go into like a nearby city, it would give the first shot. Kind of think of it as like when the United States rebelled against Great Britain. Like you have the shot that was heard around the world, right? That would be a minor incursion. And I think that's a way that I would define it. And that's an analogy that I would give. It would be like it would be the first, it would basically be the first attack. And using that definition, I think I would give a very different answer, because rather than just sending more troops, honestly, NATO needs to send troops to fight offensively. And that's where I would go with that, because, I mean, they're going into a enemy territory that we don't want them to go to. Now, all things considered, Ukraine is not a NATO territory. It's not in NATO. So does NATO actually have to do this? And obviously it looks like it's in NATO's best intention to, which is why you have the question that exists. But how NATO should respond if this is to occur, I honestly think that, I mean, we know that Russia is not doesn't want NATO to be involved at all. Putin wants them to back down. So I think, honestly, if there was a minor incursion, at least, this is going to sound horrible, at least at the beginning, I think the best thing is that NATO doesn't. I think that NATO should not respond and proceed by not doing much, because I think that it would escalate the conflict, and that provides a little bit more trouble for the situation. I think that would be my first answer. As horrible as that sounds, I'm not trying to say like Russia should go in and fully attack Ukraine. We don't want that. But I think that only makes the problem worse if a first attack is made. I think if things begin to get out of hand, then we want to see a NATO offense. And I think it really depends on like the context of the conflict. Is Russia, I guess there's a question of, is Russia going to come into Ukraine and take over the entire country, or is Russia going to take over a part of Ukraine? And that's really where that question, I think, goes for me. And I think it really depends on the context of like how offensive is Russia thinking? Are we thinking about the entire country? Are we thinking about all of Europe? Or are we just thinking about one sliver of Ukraine that typically has been involved, or that was a part of the USSR, or that the Kremlin can continue to make good, or that the Kremlin can make a part of them again?
Yeah, I think I partially agree with you in terms of just like definitions do matter, right? Like, what do they mean by minor incursion? Is it just like annexing that part of Ukraine that is very much Russian? Or is it what Spencer said in his definition, a small raid, like doing the first offensive attack, right? And I think in that instance, NATO countries should probably respond to that defensively. Because if they don't respond to that, you don't necessarily know if it is a minor incursion or not, right? Like, thing that I said at the beginning, you don't know if it's a minor incursion until after, right? If Russia does attack, I think it would be because they can take what they want to take. And whether that's like the whole of Ukraine or not, or whether that is just like part of Ukraine, I do believe that if they were to strike first, they know what they want to do in the direction that they want to take that. And in order to prevent that expansion, NATO countries would have to respond with like sending defensive troops there. Now, this isn't to say like, oh, I actually want escalation to happen and stuff like that, because I don't want escalation to happen. But I do think the way to respond to that and to, you know, uphold the same paradigm that like the US and NATO countries has already held, which is sending resources to Ukraine to defend against Russian aggression, is to just like use the troops that they have there to defend against that Russian aggression, to ensure that it's only just minor and not something that's major. And there's like other reasoning behind why I think Russia would just like, if they were to attack first, they would take the whole of Ukraine. It's because like there is little reason right now for Russia to actually strike first. Like they don't want the whole of Ukraine. They only want concessions to be made. If those concessions are not made, they will then have to look at the costs of what war or starting war would actually mean. Do they actually want all NATO countries to respond to them like NATO said that they would? Or are they willing to at least make some concessions so that they can both agree on something that works and will avoid conflict? And it's also something that like works domestically too, in terms of making the decision to go to war. If Russia were to make that first strike, it would lead to like war. That's a given. But it's also a question of, is Putin willing to make that first step and make his legitimacy seem more questionable in the eyes of the Russian population too, right? So there's like a lot of layers to this question. And I don't really like this question because of its hypotheticalness in nature, in that it probably is the least likely thing to happen. But that's just me.
Oh yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. Just to make sure everybody knows, my stance is that war is very improbable, just in general. And the reason why is because why in the actual H would you want to do that? Okay, like I honestly believe the most irrational of leaders still have a common sense of like national security or wanting to keep their power, keep their reign. Because what happens if Russia invades Ukraine, but Russia loses? Okay, like something's gonna happen, okay? And it's gonna not be good for Russia, okay? Because there's these things called treaties, okay? And eventually you get to that point and they're gonna give something up, and one of those could be Putin's power. Now that's maybe stretching it a bit, but it's a very real thing of like either national security or thinking about Putin being in power, right? Because Putin wants to stay where he is. There's no doubt about that. We can tell that from elections in Russia and so on and so forth. He's basically got the presidency for life. Okay? And that's the way that he wants it to be. So if Russia loses, right, there could be a significant cost that could backfire on Russia. I don't think they want that. I think like, and that's why I see war to be very irrational and like not as well probable, right? And obviously the thought of US and Russia going to war, obviously there's been talks in the past about like nuclear war with the two of them, right? Which is even more improbable because why in the heck would you want to kill your entire population? Hey, see, not to get onto the war rants and nuclear war rants, but like this is just in general not a very probable situation. And that's the optimistic side of things. I do think that there is a possibility it does happen. I mean, the tensions are very much there, which gives it a higher probability of war. But ultimately, war is still not likely, and Russia does not want to lose any control of anything.
And I think that perfectly leads us into the next question of, in that case, should Western powers agree to never let Ukraine join NATO, which is what Russia wants, and will say they will back down if Ukraine never joins NATO. Thoughts, Spencer?
I would agree with that question. And my reasoning behind that is I just don't, honestly, I don't really see a reason for Ukraine to join NATO. And I don't think that there is I just don't see there being a point. And that's just besides the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? Like I just don't see there really being a point, right? I don't think Zelensky is like I just don't see Ukraine in the eyes of NATO in being involved in that. And I actually would really think if we were to even offer them to join NATO, they wouldn't accept. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe they've asked to be, and I just don't recall along my lines of knowledge. But I just don't see for the life of me why we would want Ukraine in NATO. That's just me. I that's a might be a very broad answer, but I think this question absolutely has nothing to do with Russia and Ukraine. I just don't see like I the thought of Ukraine coming into NATO has never even crossed my mind once. So I don't see the point in this question. And like, of course, like the only reason why this question is coming up is because there's a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And one of the thoughts that has been Ukraine to join NATO. Okay. Like, when was the last time we actually thought about Ukraine joining NATO? Okay, honestly, please tell me. I mean, you please correct me if any of the crap that I'm saying is just wrong.
Well, I actually do think, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but like I do think like Turkey has kind of pushed for Ukraine to be in NATO just to like fight against Russian aggression, like kind of in NATO's interest because you have another country that's like on the border of Russia to check Russian power. But I also like agree with you. I don't really think there's any gain if we let Ukraine in NATO. I actually think there's a lot of harm that could come with that. Um, and what I mean by that is just based on the nature of like Article 5 and Article 4. And yes, there's like consensus based decisions where all NATO countries have to like agree on a certain action before they can invoke anything. But if you think about it in the context of like Article 5 of NATO, where if a country gets attacked, all NATO countries will be there to, you know, support them, defend them against that nation that has attacked them defensively. But they won't be there to like support them if they strike first. There's the difference and distinction there. But I think it could cause a lot of trouble for NATO if Ukraine were to be a part of NATO, just because it seems very conflict prone. But again, that's just like me. So I'm going to agree with Spencer's answer to this question of like Western powers should agree to never let Ukraine join NATO. There hasn't really been a lot of push for Ukraine being in NATO by other NATO countries besides Turkey. And no one really sees an exact benefit of Ukraine joining NATO. And that's why Ukraine has never really been on the table to join NATO in the first place. I think just from the literature that I've read, yeah, no one was really thinking about letting Ukraine into NATO. It's just Russia was scared that that would be something that's happening. I do know that like Russia wants other countries to not join NATO either. That is like bordering their country. So there's more to that than just Ukraine. But answering this question in its entirety, it's meh. We don't need Ukraine. And so
A question for you off the top of your head. Besides Turkey, how many other Eastern European countries are in NATO?
I don't exactly know, but I know Greece is a part of it, France, the UK, Germany, and there's more. I know their headquarters is in Brussels, so that's something. But NATO is really just comprised of a lot of like Western European nations. Turkey, like obviously, but
Yeah.
you know.
So don't mean to bore everybody listening. Josh can edit this out if he wants. Countries in NATO. Actually, this could be good for our listeners. Albania, Belgium, Bulgaria. There's Canada, obviously. Croatia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Montenegro, Netherlands, North Macedonia, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Turkey, UK, US. That is a lot of Eastern. Finland isn't on that list. Like,
and there's also like talks on the note of like, there's no reason for Russia to actually attack Ukraine. If
Yeah.
they were, Finland would join. Like, that would just be another loss for Russia.
Yeah. This is just honestly, this is just I mean, it's a good question to ask, but like, yeah, this is just a silly question. Like, the answer is no.
Moving on.
Question number 4. Hypothetical number 2. Let's go. If Russia invades, assuming that Russia invades, can Ukraine fight them to a draw with Western aid? YuYu, let's go.
I think so. Like, even though NATO doesn't have any obligation to protect Ukraine, they obviously will, because they see it as a form of Russian expansionism, Russian aggression, and they don't want Russia to expand further into Europe. History, like, they don't want that. And also just generally, they don't want that because it seems like they're infringing on their power. And if they were to show weakness and like let Russia invade without doing anything to stop that from happening, or to come like to force Russia to a concession or to a treaty, then it seems like their power and their hedge or whatever is weakened, and they don't want that. So if Russia were to invade, Ukraine will probably be able to fight them off with the backing of Western help. I only say this because of troops already sent to Ukraine, drones sent to Ukraine, weapons sent to Ukraine, and also like other troops in countries bordering Ukraine. I know there was like a stat that said that Russia could take Ukraine in like 27 minutes or whatever. What was that stat again, Spencer?
72 hours.
Oh, 72 hours. Sorry, not 27 minutes. I was like, that's a little low. But yeah, 72 hours, which I honestly think like mobilization of troops to Ukraine can happen within 72 hours, in which they can't like use all of that time in order to just like overtake Ukraine, if that makes sense. But then again, you also have to acknowledge that Russia doesn't want all of Ukraine anyway. Like, if they were to invade, my professors say that they're not going to go for all of Ukraine. They're probably only going to go for the part of Ukraine that is mainly Russian and like Russian based ethnicity wise, because the rest of Ukraine would be really, really angry and probably like move out as refugees, as asylum seekers, or protest.
This sounds a lot to me like the Korean War, if you want me to be honest. And I mean, I don't think that's anything to really laugh at. Because think about like the Korean War in a nutshell. It was like,
says it's not something to laugh at. Also laughs himself.
You laugh first, okay? Look, here's the thing. It was fought to like basically a standstill, right? To a draw, right? The Korean War has never ended. Okay? And that's something that we should like remember, because there's never been like a resolution of a conflict. There's never been a treaty that's been signed, right? Admittedly, the Korean War was never really a war because nobody declared conflict. So it was really a Korean conflict, but we call it a war, right? That's what this sounds like. Okay? Is if Russia's to invade, can with Western aid, can Ukraine fight them to a draw? Okay? Similar to that of Korea, okay? North and South Korea. That's what it sounds like to me, is what's being asked. And well, of course, it happened once, it can happen again. And not saying that history would repeat itself, but there's a very real situation with that. I mean, we've seen examples of something like of this in history, right? I mean, it might be a weaker example, but we've seen East and West Germany. We have, I mean, the Korean War. We've seen Vietnam, to where like, I think that this is not an improbable issue. That like, of course they can make it to a draw. Okay? It's happened and it can. I think this question makes a broad assumption that if Russia is to invade, Russia would take the entirety of Ukraine and be successful. And we can't assume that. Okay? We can't assume that Russia is going to do that, right? Wars last longer than what people think they're going to. The American Revolution, once again, providing a really old historical example, the American Revolution, we thought war was going to be done in like 2 weeks. It lasted way longer than that. The same existed with the Civil War in the United States. The same existed with the war in Afghanistan. It's a 20-year-long war. Why do we think that war and conflict is going to be quick, right? Why do we think that there's going to be absolute domination? And that's what I don't like about this question is it just feels like it's just complete domination of Ukraine and just a complete loss for the US and NATO. That's not how that works. I think that this significantly lasts longer. And I know YuYu's got some stuff to say, so I'm going to shut up.
Well, I was just like off of what you were talking about. Like, there is this thing in IR theory where you talk about like rational war. And I know we're all like, war is irrational because the reasons to go to war are rational. But there is a thing called rational war in which both sides know the costs of war and what they need to do in order to gain a particular concession is the summary of the rational explanation for starting wars. And so the war is not for total domination and like expansion like it used to be. The war is now mainly for getting concessions that you can't usually get through diplomatic negotiations. So that is also the reason why some analysts think that war is very likely to happen. Russia will strike, but not in the sense that they want to take over all of Ukraine, but in the sense that they get a concession from Western countries, especially the United States. So that's another angle to also consider and think about. But I still do think like Russia thinks the costs of war are still too high to strike first because they know that they could probably invade Ukraine and like take all of Ukraine. But have they done that? No. Why? Well, it's because they know the costs of war are really high. So they're not going to do something like that. That is very, very irrational. I know we tend to paint Putin as an irrational autocratic leader, but there are theories out there and proof out there to say that Putin is a rational actor, just in a different way that Western countries aren't used to. And I think that's something also very important to acknowledge.
Let's just pretend for a minute that Russia has been dealing with this for 8 years. Oh, wait, they have. Like, that go back to the last week's episode. That's the first thing that I explained is this has been happening since 2014. Hey, and you know it's not happened? War. Hey, like, they know the costs of war. So, like, in the hypothetical scenario of Russia invading, the cost of war is going to be much higher. It's going to last longer. Everything that you said, I'm done with this question. Let's move on to the last one. Unless you have one more thing.
No, I don't. So, last one. Is Russia becoming overextended? Short, sweet, simple. So, Spencer, is Russia becoming overextended?
This is like the most vague question on planet Earth. Like, what do you mean by overextended? Let's take a quick Google. We love
basically, don't take this question if you try it.
Overextended's definition is to make too long. Okay, so the other definition is to impose on someone or something an excessive burden of work or commitments. So, like, in essence, do we impose on Russia that there's this extension of them probably going to war? I guess that's a good way to put it. And yeah, I think we've defined that very well in this episode. Yeah, no duh. Russia is being looked at with like the viewpoint of, hey, we're a big threat. Look at us. And we're like, no, you're not. And that's the truth. Everybody's over exaggerating about this. Okay. It's important because it could happen, right? It's got a higher probability the tensions are real. Yeah. Up to you.
I guess it depends on what you mean by overextension. Are you talking about territory or are you talking about the demands, right? Because that definition could go both ways. If it's demands, Russia has overextended in asking that like Ukraine and other countries never join NATO, because that is like an excessive burden, as some would say, to NATO, to Western countries, especially with the threat of like invasion of Ukraine. That's kind of an overextended threat. But land-wise, if you think about it, Russia is already overextended by annexing Crimea in 2014. A lot of analysts will tell you, a lot of professionals will also tell you that it's like very much an overextension. Some will say it's illegal, that Russia had no right to do that. And Ukraine is still very like sour about it too, because it was part of Ukraine, like Ukraine had gained its independence. But then again, nothing conflict prone really happened with the overextension that happened in like 2014. No war has broken out. There's been conflict, but there hasn't really been like a traditional conventional war that has been fought over that. So yeah, I mean, simple, like the question, yes, Russia has overextended.
The theme of this episode, Russia and Ukraine, probably not going to war. Hey, that I think that's the simple theme. Hey, we could be wrong, and if we're wrong in if this actually does happen, please post this to Twitter. Okay, tag at the half hour. Do the same thing with Instagram. Show it to us. We'd love to see it. Prove us wrong. Okay, but
I mean, Spencer, knock on wood. That's like right behind you.
Hey, but the honest truth is we don't think it's going to happen. It's not very likely. The costs of it are just too much, and Putin doesn't want to lose what he's got. And honestly, if he thinks that he can win, he'll go for it. Hey, but I just don't see it happening. Not a very probable thing. And I think that's the general theme of the episode, and maybe a great place to wrap it up.
Yeah. In conclusion, Turkey-Ukrainian war, 10% probable. 10% because we're not sure and we're not like professionals at this. But just from like what we've gathered from information, what I've learned from my professors, it's not likely to happen. So don't be scared yet about being drafted. But other than that, I hope you got the one in the round. I hope that even if you didn't, that you will tell us how you did, tell us how we did. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to DM either me or Spencer. We are available on our Instagram, even at the email, whenever possible, whenever we can. Most likely, we'll be awake at 3 a.m. in the morning. No promises. But yeah, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, you should totally hit the subscribe button, ring the bell so you don't miss any new episodes that comes out. Remember, these episodes on YouTube come out quicker than the ones on One Clap. So if you want exclusive content, it's not really exclusive content, but early content, please subscribe. Follow our socials, the Half Hour Extemp podcast at our Twitter and our Instagram. Feel free to DM them. We will also respond to that. But other than that, thank you all so much for listening to this two-parter about Russia that is really, really important, but also maybe none of you care about, but should care about. We appreciate all the support, all the love that we're getting, and hopefully one day we'll have merch. No promises, but thanks.
Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, we will see you all later.